I'm Kay Drowan. Welcome to Program 2 in our 13-week series on The Secret of Fatima. Mr. John Haffert, co-founder of the Blue Army and an authority on Fatima, made these tapes in the late 70s. They were so relevant that we want to share them with you. At the end of the series, we will talk with the Executive Director of the Blue Army, Mr. Bill Sawkey, and bring you up to date on what is happening with Fatima today. Now, let's hear from Mr. John Haffert and the great sign and the secret of Fatima. Mr. John Haffert.
With me here in the studio is Father James Cottrell, Director of the Marian Movement for Priests of the Southeastern United States, and also pastor and rector of the Shrine of Our Lady of Fatima. Mr. Larry Thornberg, our announcer. We have something interesting to say about Larry in a moment. And Marina Ruffolo, author of this book, The Dynamic Voice of Vatican II. And we're going to discuss the first part of the secret of Fatima. Our Lady told the children, when you will see the night illumined by an unknown light, you will know that it is the great sign that God is about to chastise the world. And this sign was seen all over Europe on the night of January 25th to 26th, 1938, 3 months before Hitler marched into Austria. It's interesting to note that Hitler actually entered Vienna on May 13th, 1938, the actual anniversary of the first apparition of Fatima. But the world still had time to realize that war was imminent, according to the prophecies that had been made at Fatima, because it was not until another year, more than a year had passed, September the 3rd of 1939, that Hitler went into Poland and England declared war on Poland, and the Second Great War had begun. And now, with Father Cottrell and Larry Thornberg and Marina, we're going to discuss this great sign and what it means, why a great sign was given, and what it may mean to us at the present moment. And I mentioned that there's something interesting, especially about the presence of Larry Thornberg here. When he speaks, you're going to recognize his voice. He's our announcer. And Larry was so excited when he was announcing the titles of the programs that he held me in the studio asking me questions. And I said, Larry, they're just the questions I think the average person would ask and would like to have answered. So why did you come on the program and ask those questions? So Larry's with us today to ask those questions. Would you begin, Larry, and tell us what you have most on your mind concerning this sign?
Well, I hope I can remember all the questions that I asked that afternoon. What is interesting to me is how accurate everything became during this, and I wonder, I know there's part of this has sort of been held back, or supposedly, and I was wondering if what more we're going to learn here today.
Isn't that interesting, Larry? I think the very first thing that almost everyone asks, what is the part of the secret we don't know yet? And we were discussing in our first program on this series why there was a secret. And perhaps the first obvious explanation is that it gets attention. And still, you know, there were 100,000 people there at the day of the miracle. Prior to that, the previous time, there were 30,000 in the September phenomenon. Each time the children were there, something extraordinary happened. And the children had this colloquy. They were seen talking to an unseen person above a little tree about 6 feet above the ground. And afterwards, the crowd would crush in. What had happened? What had she said? And there was never a great deal of interest when the children said, she said this and she said that. And not a great detailed study made to, you know, if this was truly a messenger from heaven, what was this message? But what was the secret? And if you remember from our first program, the children were threatened with death if they didn't reveal the secret. It became a crucial point in the whole secret of Fatima, in the whole message of Fatima. The first part of the secret was made known. It was revealed to the Bishop of Fatima at a very early time. It was left up to his discretion to make it public. I don't think we have to analyze the reasons for this, you know, but it's the fact that the bishop found great difficulty in deciding to make them public for obvious reasons. The First World War was just ending. The vision said, this war will soon end, And when she spoke those words, the first American troops were just entering France, October 1917. And shortly afterwards, within a year, the war did end. Within months, the war ended. But then she said something absolutely incredible. She said, there will be another, a more terrible war. And it will begin in the reign of the next Pope, Pius XI. And there was no Pius XI. And how could anyone say there was going to be a war worse than that one? Because in World War I, they were saying it was, you know, the end of civilization. It was an incredible a global conflict. So to say there was going to be a more terrible war, imagine the responsibility of that single lone prelate to decide, yes, this is a message from heaven, I'm going to tell the world there's going to be another war. And then on top of that, if people do not listen, after that war, error will spread from an atheist Russia throughout the entire world. Well, in 1917, Russia was the least likely power to threaten the world. She was torn apart. She had been defeated by the Kaiser in the first phase of World War II, World War I, and then she was torn apart by the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent revolutions from 1910 to 1917. So she was a prostrate nation. And yet the prophecy was, error will spread from an atheist Russia throughout the entire world. And then on top of that, now the worst of all, the most incredible of all, if not the worst, further wars. Russia would promote further wars throughout the world. The good would be persecuted and so on. Several entire nations will be annihilated. And how could nations be annihilated? Was there going to be another deluge? You can see that the bishop had to really be absolutely convinced that this was a message from heaven before he would, as a prelate of the church, make the decision to say this is what was prophesied. And so it's understandable that it was only in 1930 that he made public this first part of the secret. Now the last part of the secret is still reserved. And this is something that very few people know. That secret was also confided to the first bishop of Fatima, the old Jose Correa da Silva. When I first went to Fatima, I was a youngster. I'm sure if the bishop knew that I wasn't really worthy of the credits that he had heard about me, I had written by chance the first English biography of Portugal's national hero, Blessed Nuno Pereira. And because of that, it would be like, suppose there was no Portuguese biography of George Washington. And suppose someone in Portugal wrote the first biography of George Washington, he might be invited to America. Well, it was that kind of thing. And there were two American writers invited after the war with the privilege of talking to Lucia, the one who talked to Our Lady. And I was one of those two because of this book. And I was the guest of the bishop in his house. And I was seated, the bishop was seated at the head of the table. I was to his right. To the right of me was Canon Oliveira, who was the go-between for the bishop to Lucia. All the memoirs of Lucia and all that documentation was through Canon Oliveira, and the two other canons across the table. The bishop was called to the telephone, and when he was gone, Canon Oliveira prodded me, a stranger, to do something that he wanted done but didn't quite dare doing. He said, ask the bishop why he doesn't open the secret. And I didn't even know about the secret. And I was just, over there because I'd been invited. I knew very little about Fatima at that time. I knew the Pope had spoken about it, and I thought it was approved and so on. But I knew very little about it, and I didn't want to seem so ignorant. So when suddenly the bishop came back, so I said to him, Your Excellency, Canon Oliveira says there's a secret that's still not opened, and he wonders why you don't open it. And the bishop looked so sternly at the canon, and he indicated that he wasn't going to open it. I think for an obvious reason. He didn't want to make that decision, but because it was written on the envelope by Lucia. It could be opened by the bishop, but in the event of the bishop's death, it was to be forwarded to the Holy Father and to be opened by 1960. So that was opened by Pope John the 23rd in 1960, and the Pope conferred with several others. This is something we didn't know until fairly recently. We knew he had conferred with Cardinal Ottaviani, was the head of the Holy Office, but also his secretary is now the Archbishop of Loreto, and is a personal friend of mine, told me this. The Pope conferred with 3 or 4 others, asking their opinion. He let them read it and asked their opinion, and they agreed with him that it should not be made public. Then Cardinal Ottaviani made a public statement in February 11th, 1967. That was the first time the Vatican had spoken about that last part of the secret. And in that, Cardinal Taviani said, what is important is the public message. He said, I read the secret. I too am bound by secrecy, but I can tell you that what is important is the first part of the message. And I think, just to close that subject, Larry, there's still the validity of the secret in that it still attracts attention, doesn't it? That's why we've named this series The Secret of Fatima, although we're dealing only with the first part, the prophecies that related to the Second World War, the spread of communism, and so on. And we still know that it's so current. Fatima is still something of now and of tomorrow, that there's still a part we don't know.
That's what I was just thinking, that this is an ongoing thing, this thing about Fatima. It just hasn't finished like with one apparition like Lourdes or other places. There's a continuing history. And I think perhaps the reason why we haven't been told about the secret, it's like the second part of the secret wasn't told in 1917. It was told later. So perhaps we're not ready yet, quite ready, to understand this third secret. And so perhaps much later we'll be able to find out. I don't think we're quite ready for it. We couldn't accept it, perhaps. It's an ongoing thing with Fatima, I think.
Yeah, well, the great sign, of which we're speaking particularly today, is obviously a great sign, not just of the First World War, but of all of these events. See, this will be the great sign by which you will know that God is about to chastise the world for its sins. And then she said there will be another more terrible war, and so on and so on. But let's look at this film for a moment of Rodriguez Molina to see how easily communism seems now, this atheistic era seems to be spreading to the world with no further sign. Well, look at the film.
This is Dr. Andres Valdespino, former law professor at Havana University, who fought for Castro because, like Manning Johnson, and like so many other good men throughout the world, he was tricked into thinking that the communist revolution was going to help his people.
Professor, you were a professor of criminal law and you're a lawyer, University of Havana. Why is it that you were a man as intelligent as you are, as well-educated as you are, how were you so duped by the Castro propaganda that you actually fought in the revolution for Castro?
You know that Cuba was a democratic country up to the 10th of March 1952, when a former dictator in Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, came to power through a coup d'etat. From that day on, we can say that the immense majority of the Cuban people started a revolutionary movement against Batista just to seek the overthrowing of its dictatorship and recover the democratic liberties and human freedoms that Batista's dictatorship had abolished. What Castro meant to us, Castro was the man who said that he represented the ideals of the Cuban people for social justice, for economical development, and for democratic liberties.
Well, there wasn't any suspicion whatever that he might have been a communist.
He was very well disguised. And another thing, you know that the Communist Party in Cuba did not back or supported Castro from the beginning. When Castro was in the struggle against Batista in the Sierra Maestra, the Communist Party in Cuba did not support or back him.
You were actually the head of the Catholic Youth of Cuba, weren't
I
you?
was, yes. No, not then. I was from 1950 to 1953. I was the president of National Catholic Youth in Cuba, yes.
Now, this man was actually in Castro's government for a year before he really realized that this was communism. And is it communism? You know, now they're surrogates of Russia and Africa. It's amazing. So the great sign was given to the world, it would appear to me, as a sign of all of these things happening. And of course, now we see them all fulfilled, and so the sign isn't that important anymore. But the thing that is, there was a sign. And I think that's very unusual.
You know, John, the communists have a marvelous media to promote communism, and yet we have this message from heaven, but we can't promote it. I mean, Lucy has been taken off. She's in a cloistered convent. The church has controlled her. How are we to promote the message of Fatima? When we're dealing with the secret, the third part, and yet we seem to be controlled so much in promoting and making known the message of Fatima.
I would feel not controlled so much, Father. Even in the case of Lucy, you know, she voluntarily entered the Carmelite cloister. She wanted to be away from the crowds, from the adulation. She's a very simple person. I sat just exactly the way I'm sitting next to Marina, 4 consecutive hours with her, and it was just as I was natural as talking to, you know, to the humblest of persons. They're very simple, very intelligent. And when you see her, the documentation, the memoirs that she's written without changing a single word, it's absolutely amazing, because most of us, you know, when we write something important, we'll go back and correct a word or so. But such a straight, clear mind. But she did think of founding an apostolate, because she was very concerned that the message wasn't being heard. And as a matter of fact, we learned this about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Before she entered the Carmelites, she had asked permission to leave the Dorothean community, which was an active community, and she was going to start an apostolate to spread the message of Fatima, sort of a confraternity. And then when the Blue Army started, she felt that was going to be the way of making it known. And then she entered the Carmelite cloister, and she has been praying for the Blue Army. But of course, she herself was the one who wrote the pledge, that is, the conditions for the fulfillment of the message of Fatima, the things that must be done in order to prevent all these things or to put an end to them. That she is in a little formula, a little spiritual commitment that now millions around the world are making. I wouldn't feel that there's any particular control. There is a great deal of opposition. The Soviets believe that this movement, this Blue Army, which is totally spiritual, is the #1 deterrent to the success of the atheist revolution in the world. In the official voice of militant atheism, the magazine Science and Religion, which is published in Leningrad, in the 50th anniversary edition, the 50th anniversary of the revolution, October of 1967, there was an article analyzing why militant atheism had not yet taken over the world. And the article gave 3 reasons. First was Hitler, that Hitler's invasion of Russia had set them back so many years. Secondly, the Cold War. And thirdly, the Blue Army of Our Lady of Fatima. And most of the article was dedicated to the Blue Army. It named me, incidentally. I suppose that's an indirect compliment, and Monsignor Colgan as co-founders of this apostolate. It was very specific. It had how many members it had, that it was not not an organization, but a crusade of prayer. It was extremely clear and specific. I often think that the Russians who read that magazine between the lines mentioned the apparitions of Fatima, the conditions of Our Lady of Fatima, the prophecies of Our Lady of Fatima, that this movement was fulfilling those conditions, but it got little things in there like it was the political arm of the capitalist dictatorship and that kind of thing, but a remarkably accurate thing. But claims that the Blue Army, the message of Fatima, is the #1 deterrent in the world. And I think that maybe the atheist's point of view is this. There are millions of people now, because of Fatima, who are praying for the conversion of Russia. You know, to put an end to this militant atheism through the world. And when people start to pray for something, they begin also to do things for it. You know, if a little boy starts to save nickels, or pray for a bicycle, it starts saving nickels to buy one. So I think maybe that's part of the reason that they feel it's so effective.
Do you feel the Blue Army has really grown in proportion to world population?
I think it's difficult to understand why a message of such importance, confirmed by the first miracle in history at a predicted time and place, with a promise from this message that there will be peace, that there will be an end to all of these evils coming into the world, including the possible annihilation of nations, that such a message is ignored by so many is difficult to understand.
And also how the Holy Father would have to suffer. And isn't he going through all of these things right now?
Yes, and we will have a program. That's one of the statements of one of the prophecies, and we will analyze that in a future program.
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that the Vatican II, with all its strength and everything, is a tremendous deterrent to these communistic ideologies in the world. And I think the Blue Army should be a tremendous help to all of Christianity and non-Christian people who believe in God.
It's interesting, Marina, that the Pope who opened the secret was John the 23rd.
Yes.
You know, the unknown part?
Yes.
And John the 23rd is the only cardinal, to my knowledge, who ever referred to the secret of 1960 in a public statement. He was the legate of Pius XII to Fatima. He was then the Cardinal Patriarch of Venice. And in his speech at Fatima, on that occasion, on May the 13th, I forget the exact date, it was in the 50s, as Cardinal of Venice, the Pope spoke of the unknown part of the secret of Fatima, never dreaming that he would be the one who would have to open it and make the decision about making it known. But very shortly after that, he decided to call the Second Vatican Council.
But also, wasn't there a request that we were supposed, the Pope, with all the bishops in the world, were supposed to have this collegiate public act of consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary for Russia? And it was done so at the Second Vatican Council, but not publicly with all the bishops throughout the world, only those bishops who were there at the time. And I think this, unless this was one of the conditions too, was fulfilled, then we wouldn't, get... But
yeah, perhaps some of the audience don't realize, because you're very knowledgeable about this, don't realize to what you're referring. One of the other signs in the message of Fatima, not the great sign, but one of the signs, when the Holy Father and all the bishops of the world unite in the act of consecrating Russia to the Immaculate Heart, Russia will be converted. It's the sign that it's over. Everybody says, well, why doesn't the Pope do it? Well, he almost did, as you mentioned, at the close of that, right after promulgation of the major document, the one you translated in your book, Lumen Gentium. And immediately after that, in the presence of all the bishops of the world, the Pope made the act of consecration and mentioned Fatima. Mentioned Fatima in the council. That's something most people don't realize. But I think we'll save that in another program, right? So Larry, pardon me, Father, Larry was so excited because what he was thinking as a Christian who is very much alive just recently to all of this new vivid Christianity that is sort of flourishing, as though the Holy Spirit were actively coming and taking over, as though this triumph that was promised to Fatima is actually beginning. And he said, I believe that we are in these apocalyptic times, and that these signs are being realized. And before he even heard of Fatima, he felt, gee, this is just a confirmation of what I already believe.
Sure. Well, I'm a layman, but not very educated in this. But there's no doubt to me, I mean, you can read your newspaper and see things being revealed on a daily basis. And the fact that things were very incredible in 1960, when they didn't want to say anything, you stop and think of the many developments that have happened in the world since 1960, that certainly things that we never dreamed about are already we're having to deal with. Look at what's going on in the Middle East. The talks that Anwar Sadat made that tremendous stride there the other day, and I mean, isn't that incredible? You know, and it's so many things. I think there may be some more, we may be able to just look at the newspapers and see for ourselves without it being a public proclamation of, well, here's what was told in secret. I mean, the heart will just open up for many people, I think. Hope so, anyway.
I think it is opening up for many, don't you think so?
Well, there's a great resurgence of spiritual activity in the whole world, not only in America. Many people that were Hell's Angels, for instance, have made public proclamations of faith. You know, we have a president in the White House who claims to be a born-again, and, you know, I believe he is. It's just going along. On the other hand, Satan seems to be working overtime, and a lot of other things going on. Drugs, pornography, and communism does seem to be, Italy's about ready to be taken over now by communists. So I guess it's going both ways, isn't it?
We have a feeling of showdown, don't we?
Yeah, right. That's what I mean. Imminent.
Right. And I think something is definitely happening. There's an outpouring of the Holy Spirit that is uniting people. And I believe that this is the triumph that was promised at Fatima. It's the triumph of the heart. And that's what is promised to us. So I think the very fact that more and more are praying with greater faith is a sign of great hope.
And also, I think we have to become so much more knowledgeable about what the church is actually trying to do for us and with us. We are the church. Like when we think of communism, they work 24 hours a day, and they'll, use any means to get to further their cause. And here we are, all wonderful people, you know, believers in God, whether we be Christians or non-Christians, and yet we are not informed as they are. So I feel that the first thing even Vatican II was trying to do is inform us, or make us aware of exactly what goes on and what the Church in this post-conciliar era is trying to do, so that it puts us in a position to countermand communism and perhaps even turn back the tide of communism. And that is one of the reasons I wrote this book, or I should say edited. They're the 16 documents of Vatican II. And the original ones are so difficult to understand. They're in this ecclesiastical terminology and very long. And I thought, well, if the faithful are supposed to know what goes on, they need to read it in their own language. So we decided to write something in a layman's vocabulary, and that's what we did. Now, hopefully, you know, when we become informed, it'll be a great help.
One of the things I like about this book is that it simplifies the documents, and many people think that, as in the Church, that the Vatican II sort of downgraded the position of Our Lady, and she was the one who appeared at Fatima. She was God's messenger at Fatima. But in Lumen Gentium, it clearly states that the devotions, traditional devotions to Our Lady, are to be fostered and encouraged. And after promulgating that document, 4 months later, Pope Paul said that the 2 primary devotions for the fulfillment of this decree were the scapular and the rosary, which are the 2 primary conditions of the Blue Army. Now, I want to thank Father Cottrell and Larry Thornberg and Marina Ruffolo, the author of the book on the Vatican documents, for being with us today, and I hope that you'll be with us next week for our next program in The Secret of Fatima.